Imagine standing on a windswept pier in Cove, Ireland, back in the mid-1950s. The air smells like salt spray and heavy coal smoke. A massive steamship pulls away from the dock. It is packed with young men and women heading for New York or London. At this point, Ireland is losing about 40,000 people every single year to emigration. The economy is effectively a ghost town. Poverty is the default setting for almost everyone. Here is the shocking truth. This tiny, struggling island would eventually report a higher GDP per capita than the United States. You probably assume this was just a natural result of hard work and a bit of luck. But how did this rainy outpost transform into the most profitable place on earth for a $1 trillion company like Apple? To understand the gold mine, we have to look at the desperation of the 1950s. Ireland was a young country trying to prove it could survive on its own. For decades, the government tried a policy called protectionism. They put up massive trade walls and high tariffs. They wanted to make everything at home. It was a noble idea, but it was a total disaster. The country was basically a closed loop of poverty. Shops were empty, farms were failing. There were almost no jobs for the next generation. By 1957, the situation was so dire that the government feared the entire state might actually collapse. Then came a man named T.K. Whitaker. He was a civil servant with a very different vision. In 1958, he released a revolutionary document called the First Programme for Economic Expansion. This was a complete 180-degree turn. He argued that Ireland should stop hiding behind walls. He wanted to open the doors to the world. The plan was simple. Invite foreign companies in, give them massive tax breaks, and let them build factories. This was the moment the tax haven DNA was first spliced into the Irish economy. The government didn't just want business. They were willing to give away the house to get it. Fast forward to the late 1970s. A tiny, scrappy company from California was looking for a way into the European market. That company was Apple. At the time, they were still just a bunch of guys in a garage making computers with wooden cases. But they had big dreams. Ireland saw an opportunity. The Irish government reached out to Steve Jobs and his team with an offer they couldn't refuse. They promised a tax holiday. This meant Apple could build a factory and pay zero tax on their exports for years. In 1980, Apple opened its first factory in Hollyhill, Cork. It was a massive deal for the local community. Suddenly, hundreds of people who were used to working on farms were assembling circuit boards. They were making the Apple II. It felt like the future had finally landed in a muddy field in Southern Ireland. But while the locals saw jobs, the executives in California saw something even better. They saw a loophole. This wasn't just about manufacturing computers. It was about where the money from those computers officially lived. Reporting at the time showed the Irish government was incredibly flexible. They were so desperate for the prestige of an American tech giant that they didn't ask too many questions. This is where the tension really started to build between Ireland and the rest of the world. Other European countries looked on with suspicion. They wondered why Ireland was allowed to play by different rules. But the Irish leaders didn't care. They were finally seeing the emigration numbers slow down. For the first time in a century, the kids weren't all leaving on steamships. This brings us to the actual mechanics of the double Irish loophole. It sounds complicated, but the logic is actually quite simple. It all starts with intellectual property, or IP. Think of IP as the secret sauce of a company. It is the patents, the logos, and the software code. Apple realized they could sell this secret sauce to their own Irish subsidiary. Once the Irish branch owned the rights to the tech, they could charge every other branch of the company a massive fee to use it. Here is the clever part. Under the Irish law of that era, a company was only taxed based on where it was controlled and managed. Apple set up a company in Ireland that was officially managed from a place with no tax, like Bermuda or the Cayman Islands. This created a ghost company. It was Irish for the purpose of receiving money, but it wasn't Irish for the purpose of paying taxes. It was a corporate phantom. Finance people still go back and forth on whether the Irish government knew exactly how big this would get. Some say it was a clever mistake. Others argue it was a calculated move to become the world's back office. Either way, the money started pouring in. It wasn't just coming in small trickles. It was a flood. Every iPhone sold in London, Paris, or Berlin saw its profits funneled through this Irish ghost structure. You see the results in the data from those early years. While the local shops in Cork were still modest, the tax filings showed billions of dollars moving through the country. It was like a giant plumbing system for cash. The money would land in Ireland, sit there for a second, and then vanish into the Caribbean. The Irish government got a tiny slice of the action through the jobs created at the factory. That was enough for them. They were happy to provide the mailbox if it meant people had work. But as the 1990s approached, the scale of this operation began to explode. The internet was coming. Software was becoming more valuable than hardware. In a world of physical goods, you have to move boxes. In a world of software, you only have to move data. This made the Irish loophole even more powerful. You didn't need a massive warehouse to store code. You just needed a legal address and a very good lawyer. The verifiable event that changed everything was the 1997 tax law update. Ireland formalised its corporate tax rate at a low 12.5%. This was much lower than the rest of Europe or the United States. It sent a signal to every CFO in Silicon Valley. Ireland wasn't just a place for a factory. It was the place to park your global wealth. The double Irish was no longer a secret trick used by a few. It became the industry standard. The drama behind the scenes was intense. American Treasury officials were starting to notice that billions in tax revenue were disappearing. They weren't happy. But Ireland stood its ground. They argued that they were a sovereign nation and could set their own rates. It was a game of high-stakes poker. If Ireland blinked, the tech companies might leave. If the US pushed too hard, they might spark a trade war. Picture a boardroom in Dublin during this era. Government officials are meeting with high-powered tech executives. The air is thick with legal jargon. The tech guys want more certainty. They want to know that their tax-free ride won't end tomorrow. The Irish officials want more investment. They want new office buildings and shiny headquarters in the Dublin Docklands. It was a marriage of convenience that would eventually rewrite the rules of global economics. As the century turned, the double Irish was fully operational. It was the golden ticket that Whitaker had dreamed of, but on a scale he never could have imagined. The island was no longer just a place of salt and coal smoke. It was becoming a hub for the biggest brands on the planet. But as the piles of cash grew higher, so did the target on Ireland's back. The rest of the world was starting to wake up to the fact that their tax dollars were being doubled away into the Irish mist. By the early 2000s, the blueprint was set. Apple had shown the world how to play the game, and now the rest of Silicon Valley was ready to join in. Think of the double Irish like a secret menu item at a restaurant. Once word got out, everyone wanted to order it. This brings us to the next big player in the story, Google. In 2003, they set up their European headquarters in Dublin. But they didn't just copy the old homework. They added a new, even more complex layer to the strategy. This was the birth of the Dutch sandwich. If you were a fly on the wall in a high-end accounting firm back then, you would have seen something truly bizarre. The goal was to make billions of dollars in profit essentially invisible to tax authorities. Here's how the sandwich worked. A customer in Paris or Madrid would buy a Google ad. That money would go to an Irish subsidiary. But before the Irish government could tax that profit, the money was sent to a shell company in the Netherlands. Why the Netherlands? Because Dutch law allowed money to move through their banks to other European countries without taking a cut. Then the final move happened. The money would travel from the Netherlands back to a second Irish company. This second company was the Ghost we talked about earlier. It was officially located in a tax haven like Bermuda. By the time the cash finished its journey, it had been scrubbed clean. It was a loop-the-loop of legal paperwork that left tax collectors dizzy. Filings from that era eventually revealed the scale. In some years, Google was moving over $10 billion through this pipeline, while paying an effective tax rate of almost zero. Now, imagine the atmosphere in Dublin during this time. The city was undergoing a massive facelift. The area around the Grand Canal Dock, which used to be full of derelict warehouses and salty air, was being rebuilt with glass and steel. They started calling it Silicon Docks. You notice the contrast immediately if you walk those streets. On one side, you have these glittering headquarters for Facebook, LinkedIn, and Google. On the other side, just a few blocks away, are the old brick terrace houses where families have lived for generations. This created a strange dual reality. On paper, Ireland was becoming one of the wealthiest nations on the planet. But for the average person living in a Dublin apartment, things didn't feel so golden. The influx of high-paid tech workers and the massive corporate presence sent property prices into the stratosphere. There's still a real disagreement on whether this era actually improved the lives of the working class, or just created a prestige bubble that most people couldn't afford to live in. The tension was also building outside of Ireland. Imagine being a treasury official in France or Germany. You watch as your own citizens spend billions on American tech products. You see the economic activity happening right in front of your eyes. But when it comes time to collect the corporate tax to pay for your roads and schools, the money has already vanished into the Irish mist. European leaders started to get loud about it. They began to call Ireland a tax pirate. They argued that Ireland was essentially stealing revenue from its neighbours by offering these backdoor deals. Meanwhile, back in the corporate boardrooms of California, the mood was triumphant. For an American tech giant, Ireland was the perfect partner. It was English-speaking, it was in the Eurozone, and it was incredibly protective of its tax secrets. The double Irish wasn't just a strategy, it was the backbone of their global expansion. Without it, companies like Google and Facebook might not have grown quite as fast as they did. They were using the saved tax money to buy up competitors and develop new products. But this massive funnel of cash created a huge problem for global statistics. It led to what some people call the disconnect. Because of the way intellectual property was moved around, Ireland's economic data started to look like science fiction. When a company moves its IP to Ireland, the value of that intangible asset is suddenly added to the country's balance sheet. This can make the GDP jump by billions of dollars overnight, without a single new job being created, or a single product being sold on the street. A notable event occurred during an earnings call for a major tech firm in the late 2000s. An analyst asked a very pointed question about the mountains of cash sitting in overseas accounts. The executive's answer was vague, but the message was clear. That money was staying put. It was trapped in Ireland, because bringing it back to the US would mean paying a 35% tax rate. So, the cash just sat there. It sat in Irish bank accounts, or was reinvested in European bonds. Ireland had become a giant, rainy piggy bank for the world's most powerful companies. Then it hits you. This wasn't just a tax trick. It was a fundamental shift in how the global economy worked. In the old days, wealth was built on things you could touch: steel, coal, cars. Now wealth was built on things you couldn't see: algorithms, brand names, and software licenses. Because you can move a license with the click of a mouse, you can move the profit just as easily. Ireland was the first country to truly realize this and capitalize on it. They turned their entire national identity into a digital clearinghouse. The drama reached a boiling point in the halls of the European Commission in Brussels. Regulators were tired of the Dutch sandwich and the double Irish. They started digging through the confidential tax agreements that Ireland had signed with companies like Apple. They suspected these weren't just low taxes. They suspected they were illegal state subsidies. The argument was that by giving Apple a special deal that no one else could get, Ireland was breaking the rules of the European single market. Reporting from that time suggests the Irish government was terrified. If the EU found them guilty, they might be forced to collect billions in back taxes. You might think a country would love a surprise multi-billion-dollar check, but Ireland didn't want the money. They knew that if they took it, their reputation as a business-friendly haven would be ruined forever. They were willing to fight in court to avoid being paid. It sounds like a comedy sketch, but it was the reality of high-level international finance. The verifiable move that signalled the end of the Wild West era happened in the mid-2000s. Under intense pressure from the world stage, the Irish government finally announced they would phase out the double Irish. The party wasn't over, but the lights were being turned up. Companies had a few years to find a new way to organise their money. But as we'll see, the tech giants are very good at finding new ways to stay in the shade. You trace the lines of this story, and you see a pattern of constant adaptation. Every time a door closed, a window opened. The Dutch sandwich might have been on the way out, but the billions of dollars were still there, swirling around the Irish coast. The disconnect between the on-paper wealth and the on-the-ground reality was only going to get wider. And in 2015, that disconnect was about to explode in a way that would leave every economist on the planet scratching their heads. The year was 2014. The world was finally emerging from a global financial crisis. Most countries were scraping the bottom of the barrel to find extra revenue for schools and hospitals. In Brussels, the headquarters of the European Union, a powerful woman named Marguerite Vestager was taking office as the competition commissioner. She didn't look like a typical bureaucrat. She was known for her blunt talk and her focus on fairness. She began to look at the tax returns of the world's biggest companies. She wanted to know why their tax bills in Europe looked like the price of a mid-sized sedan instead of the budget of a small nation. She turned her attention specifically to Ireland and a company everyone knew, Apple. The investigation began with a very simple request. The EU asked Ireland to show them the math behind the tax deals they had signed with Apple back in 1991 and 2007. These were the sweetheart deals that formed the foundation of the Apple presence in Cork. For a long time, the details of these deals were kept under lock and key. They were treated like state secrets. But the EU had the power to force them into the light. What the investigators found was even more shocking than the rumours. The filings later showed that in 2014, Apple had paid a tax rate of just 0.005% on its European profits. To put that in perspective, if you earned $50,000 that year, your total tax bill at that rate would have been about $2.50. It was essentially a rounding error. The EU Commission argued that this wasn't just a low tax rate. They argued it was state aid. In the European Union, a government is not allowed to give a specific company a massive advantage that its competitors don't get. It would be like a marathon where one runner is allowed to use a motorcycle. Picture the scene in a cold, modern press room in Brussels on August 30th, 2016. Vestager stood before a wall of cameras and dropped a financial bomb. She announced that the Irish government had to recover 13 billion euros in back taxes from Apple. She included interest in that figure too. At the time, this was the largest tax penalty in the history of the world. It was enough money to fund the entire Irish health service for a year. It was enough to build thousands of new homes in a country facing a massive housing crisis. You trace the reaction across the Atlantic and see a different kind of firestorm. In California, Tim Cook was furious. He called the ruling total political crap. He argued that Apple was the largest taxpayer in the world and that they followed the law. Meanwhile, the Obama administration's Treasury Department was also livid. They didn't like the EU reaching into the pockets of an American company. They felt that if that money belonged to anyone, it belonged to the US government. It was a three-way tug-of-war over a mountain of cash that sat in an escrow account like a giant, untouchable prize. Then came the strangest twist in the entire saga. Instead of celebrating the windfall, the Irish government immediately announced they would appeal the decision. They didn't want the 13 billion euros. Think about that for a second. A country with a small population and a lot of debt was being offered a cheque for 13 billion euros, and they said, no thank you. It felt like a surreal dream to the average Irish citizen who was struggling with rising rents and austerity measures. Inside the Dáil Éireann, the Irish Parliament, the debate was white hot. Opposing politicians stood up and shouted. They asked how the government could possibly refuse this money. They pointed to the crumbling infrastructure and the long waiting lists at hospitals. But the ruling party stood firm. Their logic was cold and calculated. They believed that if they took the money, they would be admitting that their tax system was a fraud. They feared that every other tech giant, Google, Facebook, Pfizer, would pack their bags and leave the next day. They were protecting their reputation as a safe harbour at any cost. There's still a real disagreement on whether Ireland was being brave or just being a puppet for Silicon Valley. Some analysts argue that Ireland was right to fight. They say the country's sovereignty was at stake. If the EU could tell Ireland how to tax one company, they could eventually tell Ireland how to run its entire economy. Others say it was a massive betrayal of the public trust. They saw it as the government choosing the interests of a $1 trillion corporation over the needs of its own people. Here is a micro scene that captures the tension of that moment. Imagine a small pub in a rural Irish town. The news is playing on a television in the corner. A farmer and a young software developer are sitting at the bar. The farmer looks at the screen and shakes his head. He can't understand why the government won't take the money to fix the potholes in his road. The developer, who works for a multinational in Dublin, argues that those potholes don't matter if there are no jobs. He knows his high-paying salary exists because of those tax deals. This was the divide that split the country right down the middle. While the lawyers were sharpening their pencils for the appeal, the verifiable events on the ground were changing. The EU was not backing down. They began to look at other countries too. They looked at Amazon in Luxembourg and Starbucks in the Netherlands. The era of the secret sweetheart deal was crumbling. The world was moving toward a more transparent system. But Ireland remained the front line of the battle. They were the ones holding the line for the old way of doing business. The court case dragged on for years. It moved to the General Court of the European Union. In 2020, there was a shocking reversal. The court ruled in favour of Ireland and Apple. They said the EU Commission had not proven that Apple received an illegal advantage. It was a massive victory for the Irish government. For a moment, it looked like they had won the gamble. They had defended their business-friendly brand and avoided the €13 billion gift. But the drama wasn't over. The EU Commission appealed that decision to the highest court, the European Court of Justice. The €13 billion remained sitting in that escrow account, untouched and gathering interest. It became a symbol of the struggle between national power and global regulation. Every time the interest rates moved, the pile of cash grew even larger. It was a ghost fortune that no one was allowed to spend. Reporting at the time highlighted how this battle changed Ireland's image forever. It was no longer seen as just a scrappy underdog that pulled itself up by its bootstraps. It was now viewed as a central hub in a global system of tax avoidance. The double Irish might have been officially ending, but the spirit of the deal was still alive. The tension between being a good neighbour in Europe and being a best friend to Silicon Valley was becoming impossible to manage. Now look closer at the actual impact on the ground. Despite the legal battles, the big companies didn't leave. In fact, they doubled down. They built even bigger data centres. They hired more people. But they also started moving their intellectual property in ways that would lead to one of the most bizarre economic events in human history. The double Irish was about to evolve into something even bigger. It was about to create a statistical anomaly so large that it would make the world's most famous economists think they were hallucinating. You watched the horizon and realised the storm in Brussels was just the beginning. The real shock wasn't going to come from a courtroom. It was going to come from the spreadsheets of the Irish Central Statistics Office. And when it did, it would change the way we measure the wealth of nations forever. The party in Dublin was getting louder, but the music was starting to sound very strange. It is a quiet Tuesday morning in July 2016. The staff at the Irish Central Statistics Office are preparing to release their latest report. These are usually the most boring documents on the planet. They are filled with spreadsheets about cattle prices and butter exports. But this specific report contains a number that is about to break the internet. When the data hits the screens, the analysts in London and New York think there has been a typo. The report says the Irish economy grew by 26.3% in a single year. To put that in perspective, a normal, healthy country usually grows by 2 or 3%. If a country grows by 7%, economists call it an economic miracle. But 26% is not a miracle. It is a statistical hallucination. It would be like a grown man waking up and realizing he had grown 3 feet taller overnight. You look at a number like that and you know something is broken. This was the moment the world realized the Irish, double Irish era had evolved into something even more surreal. The reaction was swift and brutal. Paul Krugman, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, took to Twitter and his New York Times column. He didn't use complicated financial jargon. He just called it leprechaun economics. He argued that the Irish growth wasn't real. He said it was just a result of big companies moving their paper wealth around to avoid the tax man. The term leprechaun economics went viral instantly. It was a massive embarrassment for the Irish government. They had spent years trying to build a reputation as a sophisticated tech hub. Now they were being mocked as a fairy tale economy. Here's the thing. The people at the statistics office weren't lying. They were just following the official rules for how you calculate gross domestic product, or GDP. But those rules were designed for a world where wealth was made of steel and wheat. They weren't designed for a world where a company could move $50 billion worth of software code with one signature. The Irish government found themselves in a bizarre position. They had to go on international television to explain why their country wasn't actually as rich as their own data said it was. So, what actually happened in 2015 to cause that spike? The answer comes down to intellectual property again. The global community was starting to crack down on the old double Irish tricks. A new set of rules from the OECD, called BEPS, was coming into play. These rules were designed to stop companies from parking their profits in tax havens like Bermuda. The big tech giants, led by Apple, saw the writing on the wall. They realized they couldn't keep their IP in a Caribbean ghost company anymore. They decided to bring that IP onshore to Ireland. Think of it like a giant library of valuable patents and logos. For years, that library was officially located on a beach in the Cayman Islands. In 2015, Apple moved the library to a small office in Ireland. Because that IP was suddenly worth hundreds of billions of dollars, the value of the Irish economy exploded. It didn't mean there were more factories. It didn't mean people got a 26% raise. It was just a massive accounting entry that changed the country's balance sheet overnight. Picture a news segment from that week. A frustrated reporter is standing in front of a shiny new office building in Dublin. He is holding a chart that shows a line going straight up into the clouds. He explains that while the chart looks like a rocket ship, the local hospital is still overcrowded. The price of a sandwich hasn't changed, the bus is still late. This was the peak of the disconnect. The numbers said Ireland was richer than almost anywhere on earth, but the reality for the average person felt exactly the same as it did the day before. The drama behind the scenes was even more intense. The Irish Treasury had a huge problem. Because their GDP had grown so much, their debt-to-GDP ratio suddenly looked amazing. It looked like Ireland had almost no debt at all. But that was a lie. If the tech companies moved their IP out again, the ratio would crash back down. They were living in a house built of digital mirrors. Finance people still go back and forth on whether the Irish government was secretly happy about the confusion. On one hand, it made their economy look strong. On the other, it made them a target for even more international criticism. The tension reached a boiling point when the Irish government realised they needed a new way to measure their own country. They couldn't rely on GDP anymore. It was a broken metric. In 2017, they created a new custom measurement called Modified GNI, or GNI Star. This was a deleprechaunized version of their economy. They stripped out all the fake wealth from the big tech companies to see what was actually happening on the ground. When they did the math, the Irish economy was about 1/3 smaller than the GDP suggested. This brings us to a real scholarly debate that still happens today. Some economists argue that Ireland is a captured state. They believe the country has become so dependent on these statistical games and corporate tax revenues that it can no longer make independent decisions. Others argue that Ireland is just being smart. They say that by hosting this IP, Ireland is securing its place in the global supply chain for the next 50 years. There is still a real disagreement on whether this onshoring of wealth is a long-term win or just another bubble waiting to burst. Imagine an investor meeting in a high-rise in London during this period. You watch as a fund manager stares at a map of Europe. He points to Ireland and shakes his head. He tells his clients that he doesn't know how to value Irish stocks because the data is too messy. He calls it a dark box economy. This lack of transparency was starting to hurt the country's credibility. The double Irish had been a clever trick, but leprechaun economics was starting to feel like a liability. Reporting at the time showed that other countries were watching this closely. They saw how Ireland had hacked the global system. Some countries, like Vietnam and Poland, began to look at ways to attract their own tech hubs. But they also saw the downside. They saw how a small country could become a hostage to the accounting decisions of a single company in California. It was a cautionary tale for the 21st century. Your economy is only as stable as the people who own the patents. Then there was the issue of tax allowances. When Apple moved its IP to Ireland, it didn't just boost the GDP, it also created a massive tax shield. Because Apple had bought this IP from its other branches, it could claim that the purchase was a massive expense. This meant they could write off billions of dollars in future profits. Even after the double Irish was supposedly dead, the companies had found a new way to keep their tax bills near zero. It was like a game of whack-a-mole, where the mole was wearing a suit and had a law degree. You notice a shift in the mood of the country during these years. The pride of the Celtic Tiger era was replaced by a kind of cynical realism. People realized that the numbers on the news had very little to do with their actual lives. They saw the giant data centers being built in the countryside. These buildings are the size of several football fields, but they only employ a few dozen people. They hum with electricity and process the world's data, but they feel like alien outposts. They are physical monuments to the on-paper economy. The verifiable reality was that Ireland had become a hub in the truest sense. It was a place where things passed through, but didn't always stick. The money flowed in and out at the speed of light. The data moved through the fiber optic cables buried under the Atlantic. And the Irish government sat in the middle, trying to keep the lights on and the companies happy. But the rest of the world was getting tired of the game. A new global movement was forming, and this time it wouldn't be just a single commissioner in Brussels making noise. The entire world was about to agree on a new set of rules that would change the Irish model forever. Now look at where we stand today, in early 2026. The world of international finance has finally caught up to the Emerald Isle. The Wild West days of the 0% effective tax rate are officially in the rearview mirror. After years of negotiation, the OECD's global minimum tax, often called Pillar 2, has finally become the law of the land. For the first time in over 20 years, Ireland's famous 12.5% rate, is no longer the bottom floor for the biggest companies on the planet. If you are a multinational group with a global turnover of more than 750 million euros, your new reality is a 15% tax rate. You might think this would be a death sentence for the Irish economic model. For decades, that 12.5% number was treated like a sacred relic. It was the lighthouse that guided every American CEO to Dublin's shores. But as the first major filings under these new rules become due in June 2026, a strange thing is happening. The tech giants aren't packing their bags. In fact, the Irish Treasury is actually bracing for a massive windfall. Reporting from the start of this year suggests that Ireland could collect an extra €5 billion annually from this top-up tax alone. But this brings us to a new kind of tension, one that some analysts are calling supersaturation. Even though the country is collecting more money than ever, its luck is becoming dangerously concentrated. Filings from last year revealed that nearly 40% of Ireland's entire corporate tax revenue now comes from just 3 massive companies. Imagine a small town where one single factory pays for the police, the fire department, and all the schools. If that one factory decides to change its accounting software, or move its patents to a different jurisdiction, the entire town's budget vanishes overnight. Ireland is no longer just a tax haven. It is a country that has become a financial hostage to its own success. Finance people still go back and forth on whether Ireland can ever truly diversify its economy. Some point to the new sovereign wealth funds the government has set up, the Future Ireland Fund and the Infrastructure, Climate and Nature Fund. They are trying to save the leprechaun gold for a rainy day. They know that this mountain of corporate cash might not last forever. There is a real concern that if the United States ever passes its own major tax reforms to bring that capital home, the Irish piggy bank could be emptied in a matter of months. A verifiable event that marked this new era was the final resolution of the Apple tax case. After a decade of legal battles that felt like a high-stakes chess match, the European Court of Justice finally had the last word in late 2024. They ruled that Apple did indeed have to pay the €13 billion back to Ireland. In 2025 and 2026, that money finally began moving out of the locked escrow account and into the Irish national budget. It was the most awkward lottery win in history. The Irish government, which had spent millions of euros in legal fees fighting not to receive this money, finally had to figure out what to do with it. Picture a government meeting in Dublin earlier this year. The mood is complicated. On one hand, they have billions of euros sitting on the table. On the other, they are desperately trying to convince other multinationals that Ireland is still a loyal partner. They are using the money to fund a massive ramp-up in housing and transport, trying to fix the very problems that the tech boom helped create. It is a race against time. They need to turn the paper wealth into real, physical infrastructure before the next global shift happens. You notice the change in the streets of Dublin today. There are fewer headlines about secret loopholes and more about the digital transition. The conversation has shifted from how can we hide the money to how can we keep the talent. Ireland is betting that if they have enough engineers, enough data centers, and a high enough quality of life, the companies will stay even if the tax rate is slightly higher. They are trying to move from being a mailbox to being a true global hub. But here is the catch. The double Irish and the Dutch sandwich were ideas born in a world of open borders and global cooperation. In 2026, the world feels much more fragmented. With trade wars and new tariffs becoming the norm, a small, open island is more vulnerable than ever. If the global economy starts to retreat into regional blocks, Ireland's position as the bridge between America and Europe could become a very lonely place to be. Analysts still argue about whether the country is prepared for a world where being neutral and business-friendly isn't enough anymore. Now look closer at the companies themselves. They have spent the last few years onshoring their intellectual property to Ireland to comply with the new rules. This means that even though they are paying more tax, their roots are deeper than ever. You trace the sheer volume of assets now held in Ireland. Patents for life-saving drugs, algorithms for social media, and logos for global brands. And it is staggering. Ireland is no longer just a place on a map. It is a digital fortress for the world's most valuable ideas. The outcome of this 60-year saga is a country that has been completely transformed, for better and for worse. Ireland escaped the poverty of the 1950s by making a deal with the giants of industry. It was a deal that brought jobs, prestige, and wealth beyond anyone's wildest dreams. But it also brought a distorted economy, a housing crisis, and a reputation that it is still trying to clean up. The double Irish might be a ghost of the past, but the lessons it taught us about the power of a small nation to disrupt the global order are still very much alive. As you watch the glass buildings of the Silicon Docks reflect the grey Irish sky, you realise that the story of Ireland is the story of the modern world. It is a story about the search for an edge in a world where capital moves at the speed of light. It is a story about how a few lines of tax code can change the fate of a nation. Ireland took the golden ticket and ran with it, and while the rules of the game have finally changed, the island is still standing, waiting to see what the next chapter of the global economy will bring. It's been quite a journey from those windswept piers in the 50s to the billion-dollar boardrooms of today. Ireland's story is a reminder of just how fast the world can change when the right, or wrong, incentives are in place. But enough about the high-level finance. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching this from today? Whether you're in a busy city or a quiet town, I'm curious to know what the economic situation feels like on your street right now. Are you seeing new industries moving in, or does it feel like things are starting to shift in a different direction? Let me know what your plans are for the rest of the year, and if you think these global tax changes will actually make a difference in your neck of the woods. If you enjoyed diving into the real truth behind Ireland's economic rise, do me a huge favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel out. And if you want to keep exploring these weird and wonderful corners of the financial world with me, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story we uncover. We have some pretty wild topics lined up for the coming weeks, and I'd love to have you along for the ride. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.